Okay, so we're on session 51 of our commentary on Mark, and we were talking about this passage where they ask Jesus by what authority he has done this action in the temple. And we, I think, covered as much as we can this word exousía in Greek, which is here translated authority. As coming from Daniel 7, which is kind of like the history of the world, whereby there's a return to the beginning. This is typical of eschatology. Reductio in principium and other expressions that say God's original intention, gone awry by human sin, will be restored effectively in the end, so that the end corresponds to the beginning. And in fact, Daniel 7 is precisely the removal of this dominion sort of usurped by the beasts or the empires from Adam through his sin, and then given to a new Adam, or one like a son of Adam, will then be really ruling alongside of the Ancient of Days, and his kingdom is forever, etc. Language very similar to the book of Revelation, Apocalypse, Revelation 5, etc. We could go on with these topics, but trying to keep it within manageable bounds. Here they ask Jesus by what authority he does this, and I think that the import of the passage theologically, from the point of view of Mark's gospel, is that the whole series of eschatological events, which began with John the Baptist, who is really the first prophet to arise in 400 years, according to the Jewish tradition, with Ezra and Nehemiah, about 400 BCE, you have the cessation of prophecy in the tradition. Now, there were prophetic utterances, mostly recyclings or rereadings of older stuff. You've got additions to Isaiah all the way up to 180 BC. You've got the book of Daniel, called a prophet in Matthew. But the book of Daniel is not among the prophets in the Hebrew canon. He's in the writings. He's not old enough to have gotten into the Hebrew canon of prophets, former or latter. He's not one of the 12. There's three great prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Daniel is the fourth only in a later tradition. So I think that when Jesus refuses to answer with what exousía you do this, with what authority you do this, by harking back to the baptism of John and putting them in a spot, they don't want to say, yes, John was from God, because they would be shown to be hypocrites for having rejected John. And they can't say, John was just a human thing he came up with, because the people held him as a prophet. And so they say, we don't know. And Jesus then says, neither will I tell you with what authority I have done this. I think he's waiting for the right moment, because when he is on trial in Mark chapter 14, and they ask him, the high priest asks him in 61, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed, or are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed? Circumlocution. Jesus responds, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And then the high priest tears his tunics here, it says, and he says, what need do we have of more witnesses that maybe are not in agreement, false witnesses, etc.? You've heard the blasphemy, and they all judged him worthy of death. So that what Jesus is really harking back to is the exousía of the Son of Man in Daniel. And he's not going back to Daniel and getting into biblical exegesis with these guys. He's going back to John. And John is the first prophet to have arisen, as I said, after 400 years or so of God sleeping. So this is the beginning now of the final events in this worldview of these kinds of circles in Judaism, Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, monks, or community, the Covenanters, there's so many Qumranites. They expected very, very similar things. Not as having dawned, the New Age not having dawned as much as Christians proclaim with Jesus, but kind of almost dawning, about to dawn kind of thing. And so we've seen this, and the following passage is going to be another sort of history of Israel passage, where in very sort of Deuteronomic terms of sending the prophets regularly and the prophets not being heard but rather mistreated or murdered, which we saw in Jeremiah 7, and it's constant in the Deuteronomic literature, former prophets, etc. Here you have the longest quote by Jesus from the Old Testament, this Isaiah 5 parable of the vineyard. I'm going to sing of my friend or my beloved's vineyard. He took care of it and expected good fruit, but he got sour grapes or bad grapes, inedible grapes. It's worth saying something about it. I want to get into something else, but this vineyard in chapter 5 of Isaiah, early on, is very, very interesting. And it's got this Jewish pun, which many people know about, but many don't. He expected mishpat from them and got mispach. He expected sort of like social justice, right religion, and social order. And instead he got violence. He sought tzedakah, righteousness, this acting according to God, and what he got was tzedakah, the outcry of the poor. So you've got these links between these passages. You know, Jesus talks about this man plants a vineyard, puts a fence, digs a pit, winepress, tower, leased it to tenants. And they beat all these tenants that he sends according to the kairoi, if I recall correctly, according to the proper times. And they mistreat them and kill them, and then crazy, I like to use sugar in Jewish, he sends his beloved son in the end, which this beloved son is the beloved son of the baptism, which we covered. He gets the messianic passage of suffering with allusions to the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22, Abraham's beloved son. And the eschaton is mentioned here. And I don't mind repeating that this Christian view of Jewish history as consisting of God speaking through the prophets who are rejected, and finally speaking through a beloved Son who is the heir. This is repeated in the first verse of the letter to the Hebrews. So I wanted to mention that again. So that you've got this parable here of the murderous vine dressers, and the owner of the kyrios, the lord of the vineyard, will come and destroy those tenants and give it to someone else. In Matthew's version, he says that's why the kingdom of God is going to be taken from you and given to a people that produces fruits. So you've got that version in Matthew, which is interesting. How Matthew adds little touches here and there. See if I can find it. I always have trouble under pressure finding things. But he comes into Jerusalem, and where is this parable of the vine dressers in Matthew? And he says that the kingdom of God, which is very rare in Matthew, by the way, using God instead of the heavens, will be taken from you and given to an ethne, sort of a nation, normally not Jews, who will give its fruit. So that is Matthew's own redaction there in the passage. And I thought I'd make a pause now to, instead of continuing to this parable, which we'll do next time or maybe even after that, I wanted to go over briefly what I had been saying, that Jesus in Mark does not purify the temple, cleanse the temple. And so I'm showing you here a page from my dissertation where I speak about the fact that 7 elements, present in Maccabees. Judas Maccabeus proposes that the sanctuary be cleansed or dedicated, and the sanctuary had been desolated and profaned, using these words that we mentioned in Jeremiah for abominations and desolation, and then taken up in Daniel. We didn't get into that too much, but we talked about the pig sacrificed on the altar, which is what this purification Hanukkah in Maccabees is all about. And so they make new vessels, skeo, the same word in Mark, brought the lampstand and the table, which Jesus overturns, into the sanctuary, and the temple curtains are spread out. That's a word that's going to appear in Mark when the temple curtain is rent from the top down, which we're going to look at, and it's linked to the baptism, etc. Gladness among the people because the reproach of the nations was turned away. And so you have, I maybe haven't gone through every little element, but I'm giving you an idea, and you can look this up in my website, the Bible Explainer Chavez, if you Google it. So in Mark, the action takes place in the temple. Any celebration with branches and palms took place prior, not after, a purported cleansing. The tables are overturned. Vessels are not permitted. The nations, tois ethnicin, are mentioned as beneficiaries, not as enemies who reproach. No altar is mentioned, although it may be the place where the abomination of the desolation will stand in 1314. There is a reference to prayer not explicitly found in the Maccabean accounts, although the people worshipped and blessed in Maccabees and petitioned God. And a portent of destruction in the citation of the verse from Jeremiah 7:11 that we talked about so much. And here you have, some detail as to the words, etc., in both Hebrew and Greek. In Mark 13, not only is the temple to be destroyed by God, it is to be made desolate and profaned by the abomination of the desolation, precisely the reverse of what Judas Maccabeus purified the temple from. Finally, when Jesus is about to die on the cross, there is darkness, not light. We're going to cover that. And the veil is completely rent. Mark could not have had a cleansing in mind. So that this is a taste of that, and E.P. Sanders, I quote, regarding this, I guess he calls it a Protestant prejudice that sacrifices are bad, but that the whole purpose of the temple was sacrifice, so that you could read that if you wanted to, at some point. Here I'm showing you what I prepared, I guess, on or about January 13, 2000, so 20 years ago, when I defended my dissertation at the Angelicum Dominican School of Theology in Rome. And in a 14-part argument, I argue this, and I think it's worthwhile to do this maybe next time. But the thesis is that Jesus' action and teaching in the temple, as narrated in Mark 11, verses 15 through 17, is a symbolic cessation of the Jewish sacrificial system and a prelude to the destruction of the temple that he predicts in 13:2. Mark subtly but carefully prepares the knowing reader for this understanding of the action from the first verses of his gospel, and symbolically depicts the destruction of the temple, rendered obsolete by Jesus' sacrificial death, by the rending of the temple curtain in 1538, simultaneously with Jesus' death. So I think maybe next time we'll look at the 14. It doesn't take that long to read. The other thing I wanted to show was a chart I prepared on interrelationships. That's what I call it, interrelationships between passages in Mark regarding Jesus's eschatological ministry. And so you've got these lines pointing from various places to others, which again, we won't have time now, but I want to pause in the sort of continuing commentary to do these kinds of excursus if you want, but basically review an overview of what I am trying to argue in all this stuff. And with that, I am going to stop.